Hey guys, it's Tuesday, so that means it's time for Quick Tip Tuesdays, so let's fire it up. In the process of mixing, one of the most important steps is EQing, but as a beginner, I didn't really understand the purpose of it, so therefore I had no clue of what I was trying to achieve, which means I didn't know how to achieve something like a super clean filtered sound, or something like a radio/phone voice filtered sound. The quick tip for this Tuesday is in the form of a checklist for beginners to help you gain some form of an objective when it comes to EQing. So number one is that you need to have an idea of what you're trying to achieve with the EQ. So some questions that may arise is, am I cleaning up the low end? Or am I removing some annoying frequency that's resonating, causing problems in the mix? Or am I going to use the EQ in a more drastic way to create a phone voice effect as mentioned earlier? So for number two on the checklist, the second thing to consider now that you know what you're trying to achieve by adding an EQ to a particular track is now what type of EQ will be best for the job. Because sometimes a simple filter will do, or sometimes you need some hardware emulation styled EQ because you need to add saturation and harmonic distortion for a specific tone. So you have to familiarize yourself with different types of EQs. Now, number three on the checklist is you have to consider your signal flow based on what you're trying to achieve. The signal flow does matter, which is dictated by the order of the plugins in the signal pipeline. Also, be aware of your DAW's signal flow order because it may vary from one DAW to the next. So because the signal flow matters, you can use an EQ and then now follow that with another EQ, both serving two totally different functions, but the order does matter. You can do an EQ, then a compressor, or you can do an EQ, then a compressor, then an EQ again. Once again, the order does matter and you will get different results based on the order of the plugins. So now with everything that I just laid out, you now see that you first have to learn how to create something like a phone voice effect or that old radio sound. And the more you learn to create those effects with different types of EQs, you will start to understand which EQs works best in certain situations. And with practice and experience, this will develop your ears. So when it's time for you to EQ, you'll have a clear vision of what type of sound you're going for with each EQ that you apply, therefore causing you to approach EQing with specific goals, which will start yielding you better, more intentional results. Now listen, if something sounds fine, you don't have to put an EQ on it. Everything in the mix does not need to be EQ'd. So make sure that you have a vision and a purpose for the EQ. When recording, we all make mistakes sometimes, no matter how experienced we are. But as engineers or producers, you want to limit the amount of mistakes by always staying on top of certain things during your recording sessions. Now, the quick tip for this Tuesday is a checklist to help you keep focused on recording correctly. Tip number one is to make sure that the cable or cables are properly plugged in on both ends. So at the recording source and at the receiving end, which would be some type of interface. Now for tip number two, get familiar with your DAW's recording indication. Now most DAWs have multiple ways to indicate that it's actually recording and what track it's recording to. Some DAWs, the channels will be red during recording, both on the mixer and on the arrangement screen. And also you'll be able to see the audio or the MIDI info being written live. So just take the time to make sure that you see and hear something actually being recorded. Tip number three is to make sure to look and see that you're recording the correct signal type. So like if you're recording one mic, but the audio is only being recorded to one side, that means you're recording a mono source to a stereo track. And what that means is that you'll end up with the audio on one side of the stereo field. And most times that's not what you want. So make sure that you set up mono tracks for mono sources respectively. For tip number 4, make sure that you are arming the right track/tracks. You don't want to have a good take completed only to find out that you recorded on the wrong track or you recorded 3 out of 4 tracks. So double check to make sure that all the necessary tracks are armed for recording. When recording, it's important to stay organized by using a sensible and streamlined workflow that will keep things in order when you move things over to the next stage of production once you're done recording. Now, the quick tip for this Tuesday is a short list of practices to help you stay organized while you're recording. Okay, so tip number 1 is to label. So while you're recording, you'll be creating new tracks for various reasons. So continue to label as you go. Also, while you're labeling, you might as well go ahead and color code also. So for tip number 2, as you're creating new tracks, you want to always route to the proper buses and sends for more efficient control. Tip number 3 is to continue to set rough levels for your volume and your sends to keep the composition balanced as you build. That goes a long way to keep the vibe and inspiration going during the session. Tip number 4 is to undo your bad takes and trim the excess from the front and the end of your recorded clips, preferably with snapping turned on to help keep things neat for later editing tasks like copying and pasting to new locations. And for tip number 5, try not to use an unnecessary amount of tracks to record. So for example, the main vocals on your verse should not be laid out across 6 different tracks. Usually under normal circumstances, 2 tracks should be more than enough to take care of those parts that may overlap for the main vocal on your verse. So plan and be efficient with how many tracks you actually need to record the various parts of your song. When mixing, you become responsible for the tone, the texture, and the overall vibe of the track. And one of the ways to affect this is with spatial effects. Now, the quick tip for this Tuesday is to always EQ your send effects. Now, just like all of your standard instrument and vocal tracks in your mix, you are required to EQ send tracks to maintain control and balance over the frequencies in your mix. So for example, with the more common send effects like reverb and delay, it's extremely important to shape and carve out their space in the mix with EQ, which almost always starts with a high pass filter to roll out the low end. Okay guys, that was the quick tip for this Tuesday. Thanks for watching, and as always, you'll see me in the next video.